Okay, good morning. Good Chodesh. We are today focusing on Mem Gimel Amud Aleph. We are on Mem Beis Amud Beis, a few lines up from the white lines by the two dots. So I just wanted to be mashing a couple of things from yesterday. Number one, that we had said that there was a machlekes between Rav and a whole bunch of others in relation to a situation when if you had wine that came during the meal, which we understand sometimes wine comes during the meal to drink, and sometimes it comes during the meal to help with the digestion. So if wine comes in the meal for the digestion, so it's not going to help, says certain of the Amiram, for the wine that's going to come afterwards. Rav Amma Paiter, Rav Kahana said, Ain a Paiter. Rav Nachman said Paiter. Rav Shesha said, Ain a Paiter. Rav Huna Rav Huda, Chol Tamida de Rav Amri Ain a Paiter. So I just wanted to mention that, and I don't know if I said it yesterday. Number one, I think I mentioned maybe why is Rav Kahana not included as part of the Talmidei de Rav. I understand Rav Shesha is a student of Rav Yirmiyah Bar Abba, who's a student of Rav, so he's a generation removed, but Rav Kahana was a student of Rav. We're going to have later on the Gemara Brachot Samach Beis. I mentioned yesterday Gemara of a Kama Kufiyud Zayin. We have the Gemara Shabbos Kufin Beis, where Rav is talking in front of Rav Kahana is reading out Psukim in front of Rav. So he seems like a student of Rav. Why is he put separately in this Gemara? I'm not sure. Secondly, I don't understand, as we already had a couple of times in Taisvis beforehand, if you recall. Taisvis told us, it was also in Taisvis Lamed Tesam and Beis, Taisvis Devar Maskal Mavarich. The last lines of Taisvis was that we go when there's machlekes Rav Yechanan, Allah is Rav Yechanan. The Kolshkin the Gab Rafuna Shalach Kamosh Asher Tamid Sharav. Dafka ba'amaroi basroi. I mean, kehalach basroi. The dafka when we have basroi people, that's when we say halach is basroi. But if somebody's a student of them, then we don't say that the halach is like the basroi. And this was an opinion of Tesis that Tesis repeated that as a fundamental thing. He said it again on Mem Beis, the top Tesis. Rabbi Yochanan Mafil Pasvi Ayin Tesis Sevachin Halacha. The Rabbi Yochanan Halacha Rabbi Yochanan Mekol Gaber Rapuna Shor Talmidei Sharav. Now you don't consider him like basroi. You don't add him to the list. I don't understand. This Gemara is showing you here that the Talmidim of Rav are willing to argue in Rav. So if they're willing to argue on Rav, why don't you say that they're basroi? So I'm saying that as a question on that thesis. I'm not 100% sure. That was point number one, and maybe point number two. Point number three is to discuss the thesis here. I was going to do it with the Taisa Rush, but we'll look first at the Taisa here to show a bit of this point. The Taisa says, in the Taisa of Rav Sheshes, we didn't have a chance to do it yesterday. It's a long Taisa, we're not going to do the whole thing, but just the beginning part of it at least. Venira, so Taisa says, the halacha ki talmidei de Rav. Here in this machlekes between Rav Kahana, Rav Sheshes, Rav Yehuda, Rav Huna, all of them, we have all these different opinions. So Taisa says that I think the halacha is going to be like the students of Rav, meaning like what? Like the students and not like the Rebbe, not like Rav himself. The Rav Sheshes koy kavasaihu, because Rav Sheshes goes like them. The halacha kavasai you have nach medina Rav Sheshes b'Yisrei. I think I mentioned on Sunday, right, about the Kolei HaPsak. So this is here is bringing down one of the Kolei HaPsak, is that we pass like Rav Nachman when it comes to Dinim, and like Rav Sheshes when it comes to Isser, Beheter. Since Rav Sheshes says that it's not Paiter, so then the halach is like Rav Sheshes. So the Taish then continues, but I have a problem. I have two Kolei HaPsak that seem to contradict each other. We said that Rav Nachman Rav Sheshes, the halach is like Rav Nachman be Dinei and Rav Sheshes be Surei, but we also know that there's a machlekes Rav and Shmuel. The halach is like Shmuel B'Dinei and like Rav B'Surei. So if I forgot the kind of the Rav Shmuel, Rav B'Surei, so then I have a problem because I have be passing like Rav when it comes to Itzavet. Then we passing like Rav Sheshes when it comes to Itzavet. But when Rav and Rav Sheshes disagree, who do we go like? That's the question over here. Says Taisus no shiny hacha the whole tamide the Rav pligi allow. Here it's different because here we see that the students of Rav, all the students of Rav, are arguing on Rav. Maybe that's how you want to translate the Gemara when we say Rav Huna, Rav Huda, v'chol Talmidei Rav. Maybe that's going back on Rav Kahana. I don't know. Maybe it includes Rav Shez because he's a student of Rabbi Abraham, who's a student of Rav. But Kol Talmidei Rav Pligilel Mistama Kach Shamu Meirav. So he says Mistama. That's what they heard from Rav. What do you mean Mistama? They heard that from Rav. Rav doesn't say that. So if you look at Teres HaRash, the Teres HaRash says over here that he probably was chayzer. He was probably chayzer. Rav was probably chayzer. If all the students are disagreeing, he's probably chayzer. If that's the case, that we want to now insinuate that we pass like of Sheish as against Rav, even though we say according to each one the halacha is b'isur like each one, and the reason must be because if all the students of Rav are arguing, Rav must be that they heard it from him like that, and then he's reversed himself. So then that might explain then again why when it comes to what Taisa said before, that we're not going to go with Rav Huna as a Basroi because he's a student of Rav. He just repeats the opinions of his Rebbe. So then this is not going to be able to be used as a question because once we're saying that Rav was Chayzer and the students of Rav are going with Rav, so then what's the right? Again, they're not Basroi because they just repeated whatever the Rebbe said. The Rebbe changed his mind, so they changed his mind. This initial quote from Rav that he says, Paiter is just before he reversed himself. That's, I think, how one would be able to answer up Taisus. Otherwise, I do think this Gemara would be a challenge. Okay? All right. The rest of Taisvis, I'm not really sure that we have so much time to do, so we will move on. Okay. So continues the Gemara. We are now at the two dots. So the two dots, Baruch ala pas poter sapar Paris. So yesterday we didn't have a chance. We missed the one Taisus on Membez Amalaf, two Taisus on Membez Amalaf, two Taisus in. I just mentioned here, it's Machlokes Rashi and Taisus. Taisus really brings down the rack as to what Paris is. It's like an appetizer. So Rashi says it's a pargia, it's fidagim, things like that, that they would eat before the meal. The Lashon Rashi is lahamshech achila. And after they'll bring the table to sit and to recline and to eat. So they had long meals. Taisus says that Menir Kiperish Rach, the Perish Paris Bas Tsenum Bekaira, right? That's the bread that comes like with the onion soup that we talked about before. That's what it means Paris. Fine, I'm not 100% sure, but that is for our purposes now. The Mishnah had told us as follows. The Mishnah had said, Baruch ala pas parter sapar Paris, ala Paris loy parter sapas. If somebody made a bracha on the pas, so they don't have to make any, they made a hametzi on the pas, they don't have to make any more brachas on the appetizers. But vice versa, if they made a bracha on the appetizers, they still have to make a bracha of hametzi on the pas. And then the Mishnah continues and Beishami Aim Afle Maisa Kedera. Even not on the Maisa Kedera. So we don't really know what that means. So for the Gemara, the Gemara asks, Ibayalhu what? Beishame Aresha Pligi, Oy Dilma Asefa Pligi. This line of Beishamai that he says that if you're making a bracha on the that it's not going to help with the Maisa Kedera, is he talking about the Resha or is he talking about the Seifa? We're not sure. So the Gemara says like this. The Tanakama Baruch ala pas Poter sapar Paris. When the Tanakama, the first part of the cut of the Mishnah, that said that the Tanakama says if somebody made hametzi on the pas, they're poter on the appetizers, and presumably then the Tanakama is saying v'kol shekei ma'aseh kedera. Then presumably not only when you make hametzi they're going to pater up the paperas, but it's also going to be patering up the ma'aseh kedera. So then when Beishamai says v'asi Beishamai lemeimar loy miboya parperas loy patra. It's not just that by Paris that it's not patering the loy patra lupas. Elafil ma'aseh kedera not loy patra. Maybe Sham is coming along and disagreeing with that fundamentally and saying it's not just that the hamayish that you made on the pas is not working for the Paris, but it's not even going to work for the ma'aseh kedera. Oidilma a seifa pligi, or maybe Beis Shammai is coming to argue on the seifa. Diktani baruch alav Paris loy pater sapas. It said that when you make a bracha on the paperas, it's not going to pater up the pas. And then the tiny berach al paperas loy pater the pas. Pas hu deloy pater av a ma'aseh kedera pater. So you would assume that what does it mean that it's not patering up the pas? Not patering up pas. Pas hamaitzi, it requires another bracha. But Ma'aseh Kedera, it would be patering up. You wouldn't need another bracha. Vasi b'sham l'mem v'afil Ma'aseh Kedera nami loy pater. And Misham is coming to argue on this as well and say that Ma'aseh Kedera is also not pater. You also have to make a separate bracha on that. The Mercer's take it. We're not sure exactly what Beis Shammai was coming to argue on. Either he was coming to argue on the first part or the second part, but it's not so clear from the Mishnah. Either way, continues the Gemara. So now we have the next part of the Mishnah. The Mishnah told us that if people were sitting, if everybody was sitting, each one made a separate bracha on the wine. And if you looked at Rashi Amud Aleph told us at the bottom, that's without reclining on the couches. That they would lean on their left side. So in that situation, when they're sitting without Heseba, one person makes a bracha for everyone. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Each person makes their own bracha. But Hesebo, if they are leaning, if they're reclining on the couches, so then Echad Mevarach L'Kulan. Why? Because we don't consider it a Kviyas Suda when each one is sort of sitting. Sitting in the way they had their meals was not considered Kviyas Suda. Reclining was considered a Kviyas Suda. Reclining on a couch, and they didn't have that. Taisus in the last Taisus of Heseba repeats what he already said in the Taisus of Salak. We don't have to do the whole thing, but if you remember in Taisus of Salak earlier on the page, Taisus said Anu Regilim the bottom of Taisus Aval Anu Sheregilim Lechol Kulan Al Shulchan Echad Ein No Salak Shulchan. Right, so we all sit by a table. We're not reclining. Taisus here says on the bottom part of Taisus says basically the same idea. Taisus says Ve'en Lanu Anu Ein Lanu Aseba El B'Pas Bilvad. Upas mahani afilu beloy haseba. The dafka did who in those days in their generations they needed to have a seba. Shayu oichlan be haseba utrichen haseba. Since eating bread alone was not a kviyas suda, sitting by the table was not a kviyas suda, because by them a real meal meant you're sitting down, reclining on a couch, on your left side. That's how they ate. I don't really understand it, but that's how they ate, right? El yeshiva shalanu have kviyas suda, right? But our sitting, says Taisus, our sitting on a chair, that's a kviyas for us. Kehaseba did who? It's like their version of a seba. When you sit down at a table nowadays, that's a seba. That's a kviyas suda right there. We don't lean and lie down and any of that stuff. That's not our way of eating. Shehem hayurigim kol echad lahasiv al mitas al shulchanai. So for us, Kriya Suda is to sit down at a table. Remember this? I did this thesis in part to explain the next Gemara, but really, for a thesis that I'm going to get to at the end of today. This is a key line. One more point, which will also be a key line for later, and it's the last line of the big thesis of Rav Sheshes. Look at the last line of Taisus. Taisus says, "Miu yesh shemachmiu lahavdil kedum netilas yadayim." Now, those that are machmir to mavdil before netilas yadayim, what is he talking about? Who makes havdil before netilas yadayim? Who makes havdil after netilas yadayim? What does netilas yadayim have to do with anything? Obviously, we're talking about netilas yadayim, presumably from Rav Malka. This will also potentially relate to the wider question of kiddush and netilas yadayim, which we're going to see later on. Do you make netilas yadayim before you make kiddush? And then what is the yeki over here? So nobody knows what I'm talking about, but we will see later on. So anyhow, in the point now that we're making, Taisus says there are those that are machmir to be mavdil before netilas yadayim, la'afuke nafshayu miplukta, in order to avoid any potential argument about a dispute. The azvade tzarich levarach achar brachim in shalish. Everybody's going to say you have to make an al hagefen. It's not going to be pattering up the wine that you had later on. Okay. For our purposes now, there could be seen a difference between Havdalah and Kiddush. Remember, and I really wasn't planning to do this whole Taisus here, but one of the big discussions in this Taisus is in relation to Shabbos and Yantif, Kiddush, versus a regular meal. How bidavka is it? So Taisus' basic point is that it could very well be that Shabbos and Yantif is not bidavka. It could be tzlav davka, and if somebody intended to have a meal where they're going to have wine, it will be the same thing. Because when we say by Shabbos, Kiddush works to pat up whatever's going to happen during the meal. So it could be that in a regular meal, a nice meal where there's going to be wine during the meal, and if you had wine at the beginning, that will also potter up the wine that's coming later. Is Havdalah the same as that or not? So is Havdalah like Kiddush on Shabbos and Yontif, or is it maybe like wine during the regular week? If you say that Shabbos and Yontif is Dafka, and maybe like during the week it's not Dafka, where would Havdalah sit? So the suggestion of Tosfos brings down two opinions about Havdalah. And the suggestion could be that Havdalah might be seen as different. Why? Because Havdalah is not really something that somebody's making a meal out of. It's not like you're sitting down to be kivea a meal with Havdalah. So when you made Havdalah, and then you're going to have later on your what do you call your Lav Malka, maybe it's not really patching it because it wasn't like by Kiddush where you're sitting down for a meal and you're expecting to have wine during the meal and you made Kiddush and it's going to patter up everything. Maybe there's a difference. This is another thing that we don't have time to go through this whole thesis, but another thing to bear in mind, as we're going to see later on in the thesis on Mem Gimel. Okay, coming back to the Gemara. So the Mishnah told us that Hayu Yoshvin Kol Echad VeEchad. So if everybody was sitting, and remember we're saying sitting, not reclining, right? That's key. The Mishnah told us Hayu Yoshvin Kol Echad VeEchad Mevarach La'atzmai. Hesei by echad mevarach l'kulan. Says the Gemara, hesei by en, loy hesei by loy. If they were reclining, then the halacha would be different. Hesei by en, loy hesei by loy. If they're reclining, then they could make one bracha for all. But if they're not reclining, then each one has to make their own bracha. Practically, very minu. I'll ask you a stira. We know there's a Tosefta sar shayochem b'derech. If there were a minion of people traveling on a caravan, and when there came time to eat, they're sharing one loaf of bread. They all make bracha for themselves. They don't have one bracha hamaitzi for everybody. Yeshvu, if they sat, meaning they stopped the caravan, they sat down. So Yeshvu lechel, even though each person is eating from his own bukla, each person has his own bread, echad mevarach l'kulam. So one person is able to make a bracha hamaitzi for everybody. Says the Gemara, Katani Yeshvu, afal pisha lo hasebu. This sounds like that you're merely sitting. Your action of just being yeshev is enough to have one person being mevarach for everybody without being mason, without reclining. So that's a steer to what? To what we just said in the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that if it's yeshvu, each one makes their own bracha. But it's say by one person makes the bracha for everybody. And here you don't see that. Says the Gemara, Amar Nachman Bar Yitzchak Kigoin de Amri Nezel v'Nechel Lachma B'Dun Plach. Nachman Yitzchak says that these caravan of people that were traveling, they said amongst one another, "Oh, let's stop and eat at this place." What's going to be if we say that? Says Rashi, b'mokim ploini. They made an agreement among themselves while they're traveling in the caravan that they're going to stop at a certain place. The kavul ahem mitchila mokim b'dibur. They were kaveh mokim with their speech. Ve'etza v'azmana havikvias, and that kind of a language, that kind of preparation, is considered kviyas suda. Avol yeshvu ma'aleim b'mokim echad yachad eina kviyas. But if they all just, Humpty Dumpty, what does it go? I forget exactly. But they all fell down in one place and they all happened to be eating. That's not kviyas suda. That's not kviyas suda. If you agreed they're going to stop at a certain place, then you compare that place with your dibur. And then when you sat down to eat that's considered kviyas suda. You don't need haseba in order to make it a kviyas suda, and therefore one person can make a bracha for everyone. But if you don't have a kviyas suda, it's not a meal. Each person's doing their own thing. It happens to be they're all eating from one loaf of bread and they all sat down together at the same time, fine. But there's no kviyas suda here. For that, you need a haseba. Right? So again, we're talking about in their days. In their days, when haseba was the way you were kviyas suda, there was another way to do it as well. And that is with dibur. But if you don't have dibur and everyone's sitting, that's not a kviyas suda. For that, you require a seba. That's the Gemara until here. Says the Gemara now a story. Kinoach nafshi derav. When Rav passed away, Azul Talmid of Basra, so the Talmid went to go bury him, right? Rashi explains the Kavru Be'ir Acheres. They buried him in a different town. Kihadra, when they were returning, Amri Nezel V'Nechol Lachma Nahar Danak. They said, let's stop, and when we get to this river, we should eat. Basa the Krachi Yasiv Kamaborle. So after they finished eating, they started talking to one another and learning. And said like this: they asked each other, "Sebu dafka tanan, avol yeshvu loy." Here we're not reclining; we're sitting. We're sitting at this river, Nahar Danak. So we're just sitting. Does that mean that since we're just sitting, that we can't have a situation where one is making a bracha for everybody because a seba is dafka? Aidilma kevin da amri nechel v'nezel. Aidilma kevin da amri nezel v'nechel rifta beduchta plan nisa kiye sebu dami. Or maybe because we agreed that we should all stop at this river, that's considered as seba, and that's considered to be a situation where one person can make a bracha now for everybody. So the what do you call it? The Gemara says have biyadai. They didn't know. They weren't sure what to do. What they weren't clear as to what the halacha would be in this situation. Right? Do you consider this a kviyah suda, which is one meal one person can bench for everyone, or it's a situation where everybody is where everybody's sort of eaten separately. So Kamar Adabar Ahad, we're now turning the page now to Mem Gimel and Aleph. So Adabar Ahava got up. Adar Kari L'Achoyrel. He turned his kriya. That he already turned kriya when he went to Rav's, Levaya. He was the Rebbe, so he had his shirt was already had a kriya on it. So then he turned it around to the other side. B'kara kriya achrina, and he made another rip in his shirt. Amar neach nafshi derav uberchas mezayna loigamrinan. Rav passed away. We don't even know how to make the bracha of benching. We don't even know how to do this. So it's worthy of making another kriya. The asahu saba until a certain older rabbi came along. Ramalu masnisan abraisa. He made a steer between the Mishnah and the Brisa, right? Because we just said this question about the Mishnah says Yoshvin versus Hasebay, right? Yoshvin is Kolach Mavarach Atzmai, and Hasebay is Echem Mavarach Kulan. And then we had a Brisa. The Brisa said that if somebody was traveling, but right? And then you could have a situation each person eating from his own bread, and then one person could bench for everybody. So that sounded like Yeshua was without a seba. So it sounds like a steer between the Mishnah and the Brisa. So this elderly person said, he put this Mishnah in conflict with the Brisa. It's the same answer that Nachman Yitzchak gave, which is once you say that you are being kaveh the Suda in this place, they said they're going to stop at the river Danak, so then that's considered kaveh with Dibur, and you do not have to actually be masive. Simply sinning is sufficient to be kaveh Suda, and therefore even if each person is eating from their own kikar, one person can bench, bless you, one person can bench for everyone. That is the Gemara here until the two dots. I just wanted to mention that the Gemara tells us in my Kanach of Dal, all the stories about various people who died. So one of them is a story about Shmuel. When Rav died, so there's a story about Shmuel. So the Gemara says that when Rav passed away, they told Shmuel that he died, and he tore 12 pieces of clothing of his. I don't really understand what that means, but he was tearing kriya on Shmuel. Shmuel was tearing kriya on hearing about Rav's death, but he heard about Rav's death and all that significantly after Rav passed away. Significantly after Rav passed away. So the Gemara wanted to know the following: the context of this story that Shmuel tore kriya, right? Shmuel is writing kriya on Rav's death. The context is that the Gemara says over there in Marikon Chav Daled that kol kara she'enei b'shas chimum enei kara. It's not considered kriya if you don't do it when the news is hot, when the news is fresh. So the Gemara asks, but Shemuel was doing tearing kriya on Rav's death, and Rav had passed away significantly before. So why is Shmuel tearing kriya so much? And the Gemara answers that the shani Rabbanan they came from the kol shaita mitkiri shmaitzu kishas chimum dami. That because of the fact that every time we mention their words, it's such a blow to the heart. It's such a tear at the heart because now you remember all the things that we don't know, all the things that we didn't learn. So therefore, it's like you need to tear kriya. It's fresh. So it's funny, yeah, not funny, but it's the same exact situation that we have in our Gemara. Our Gemara is a proof to the same thing. Why is Rav Bar tearing kriya anymore? They already left. Rav is buried in some other place. They've been traveling now for days. Now they got to the river Danak and they're tearing kriya again. Yes, because now they remember they don't know halacha. Rav taught them so much halacha and they forgot. So now it's time to rip kriya again because it's like a new hearing, a new shmua that's still shas chilum. It's still hot for them. So therefore, it's time to rise kriya. That is the essentially the Gemara Ma'ikon, which I think fits very nicely with the Gemara here in Brachos. No, of course not every time, but when it's still relatively fresh, when it, unfortunately, as time goes on, as time goes by, these things don't have the same resonance. But the last thing just to mention is the Gemara tells us in Sanhedrin Mem Zayin about that Rav's grave became like a shrine. People would go. It's kind of an interesting thing because the Yerushalmi tells us in Shkolim that we don't make and we don't make a nefesh. They called it a nefesh. Matzeva, they called it a nefesh. I'm not sure exactly why, but they called it a nefesh, and we don't make nefesh by the tzaddikim. Why? Rambam says we don't. Divrayim heim zechronam. Their words are what they've remembered by. Now you don't need their. But the Gemara says they used to go to Rav's. They used to go to Rav's caver and take the dirt and use it for people who were sick. I would like to make them feel better. Yeah, all right, maybe it's a source for the other side of the equation that does go to graves. All right, not for our topic now, although it's an interesting one. Continues the Gemara. So what did the Mishnah tell us next? And the Mishnah said, Heseba, if it was a situation where they did do Heseba, so then Echad Mevarech L'Kulam. Then one person is able to make a bracha for everyone. Yeah, one person is able to make a bracha for everyone. Says the Gemara, Amarav Loishon ala pas the Bayaseba. This is true that when you're masive, when you do this reclining, that it works, that one person makes a bracha for everybody, that's only true by pas. However, and then why? Because pas requires a seba. That's how you eat. However, when it comes to what? Yayin, aval yayin loy bayaseba. When it comes to yayin doesn't require haseba. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Rabbi Yochanan says, afilu yayin nami bayaseba. Even wine also requires haseba. That is to say, there could be a kfiyas of a suda on yayin, in the same way that there could be on pas, and according to Rav, only by pas and not by yayin. Says the Gemara, another version of this machlokes between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan is Amar Rav lo yishon ala pas de mahanya haseba. When does haseba work? Only for pas. Avol yayin lo mahanya haseba. By yayin, even if you wanted to be mesiv, it's not going to do anything for you. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. Afilu yayin nami mahanya haseba. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees and he says no. By yayin haseba can also work. So two versions of what the machlokes between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan is. According to the first version, Rav is saying that yayin doesn't work with haseba, right? Yayin doesn't require haseba, but pas requires haseba. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, yayin also can require haseba. But according to the second version, Rav says that yayin, even if you were masiv for yayin, it doesn't do anything. whereas for pas it does. Whereas according to Rabbi Yochanan, if you are Mesav by Yain, it will work, and that will be considered as Seba, that will be considered Kfiyah Suda. So now the Gemara asks a question from another Tosefta. Meisvei, for the Gemara, Ketzad Seder Haseba. How did Haseba work? Archen Nichnasim v'Yoshua Agabe Safsalin. You'd have the guests; they would come in, and they would sit on the chairs. V'Agabe kat the benches. V'Agabe kasedros, also type of chairs. Ad sheyichnasu kulam. So you have all these guests; they're all coming into the house, and they're sitting on various benches and chairs. Ad sheyichnasu kulam, until everybody arrives. Heviu lahem mayim, they bring them water. Each one does natila on one hand. Each one makes his own bracha on the wine. Then they go and they recline. So they leave wherever they were and they go now and recline on their couches. And then they get water. Even though they had already done natila on one hand, then they now do natila on two hands. Now when wine comes to them, even though they'd already all made a bracha for themselves on the wine, now now one person is going to make a bracha for everybody. Okay, let's see Rashi just to get a better idea of this. As Seba says, Rashi, in Rashi Shani Archen, Rashi tells us that that the way they v'derech bali batim ashirim hayu lezamin lesudasam archmanim lahachi karlu archem. Right, they're called archem, the Iraq, these guests, because they would all come. It was the custom of rich balabatim to have a lot of poor people at their table, and what they would do is essentially have two parts to the meal. There was a part where they were waiting for all the guests to come, so they would have some wine and they would be waiting around, but they were not yet reclining. So they would just be sitting on chairs and these casedras or benches, whatever they exactly were. As Rashi says, eventually they would get up from there and go and recline someplace else. This was not the place of the Masiba. This area where they were first, in the anteroom, whatever it was, the foyer, the living room, whatever exactly it was, that was a place where they just were, sort of having, what's the fancy word, aperitifs? I think that's what it's called, right? No, different one. With the one with wine. So that is part one. And then when everybody came, then they would go to the dining room, and there would be lie down on the couches and have haseba. So now the Gemara says the following. So this is the story of haseba. This is how it happened in these rich Balibatim's homes with the various guests that were there. So now the Gemara says, "Leheich lishna de Amar Rav lo shanu ela pasta b'yaseba avayayin loy b'yaseba kasharesha." According to the version, remember we have two versions of what Rav said. According to the first version, what Rav said is that he said that the only time that we say haseba echad mevarach l'kulam is only by pas, but yain doesn't require a seba. Rabbi Yochanan says even yain could require a seba. So the Gemara says laheich lishna de Amar Rav lo shanu ela pasta b'yaseba. According to the first version of Rav, it says the yain doesn't require a seba kasha reisha. Then the first part of this Pesach is a problem, because the first part of this Pesach makes it clear that the reason that they're having each person make their own bracha on the wine was why? Because they were only yoshev on the safsal and the kasedrios. They weren't being masiv. So since they were only being yoshev and they weren't being masiv, so each one had to make their own blessing, which tells me that what? That if they were able to each, when they're able to actually sit down and they're able to be masiv, then one person able to make a bracha for all of them. That shows you that yain is also by seba. It could also be kaveh sudan seba. So says the Gemara that no, it's not a question on Rav. Shiny archin that tayu leme'ekar, right? Because they always were planning on moving. They were never planning on eating here. Since this was never a place for a seba, so there's no chance even to consider the idea that yain requires a seba. Yain does not have anything to do with a seba, right? It is therefore for that reason that each one had to make their own bracha. Correct. Haseba would not have. Haseba was simply not on the menu at that stage. And according to the second version of Rav, where Rav says that a seba doesn't help, we don't understand the seifa because clearly a seba does help. Because the second part of the Tosefta said what? That when they were masiv, only one person had to make the bracha, and he would be Yitzhak and everybody. So you see, his seba does work. On that, the Gemara says, "Shani Hasan the migu to come mahanya lehaseba lepas mahanya lehaseba leyayin." Right, that we have like a migu, right? It's not a migu in the sense of Bava Kama type of migus, but it's nevertheless a migu that what? That since you have a haseba for the pas, so we're going to have a haseba for the yayin. Why are you differentiating it? When you're sitting down and reclining, and you're going to have bread, and you're going to have wine, so yes, it's of course there's a haseba for the yayin. Rav's not disagreeing with that, but there's not a haseba for the yayin per se. You're having the seba for the pas, and migu they have a seba for the pas that also works. That you're considered to have a seba for the yayin as well, but that's not some major chiddush now. That Rav would say that you have a seba, it's going to work for yayin without pas. That's not what we're discussing. That wasn't the situation over here. So it comes out that there's no fundamental questions on Rav. Okay, we have another minute. We have to do this next Gemara in order to do this Taisis. The next Gemara says, "Bolahem yayin b'soich hamazon." The wine came to them during the meal. The Charlas ben Zayn, the Mishnah told us that when if the yain comes during the meal, everybody has to make their own bracha. So Mo wants to know why. Charlas ben Zayn, why is it? We're not talking about a situation when there was wine before the meal, right? It's just you made hamaitzi, no wine, and then they bring you wine, and now you're drinking wine. So what do we say? You have to make a bracha by gefen. Right? You have to make a bracha by gefen. So they asked Ben Zema, why is it that each one has to make a bracha by gefen? Why can't we say that one person makes a bracha for everybody? So on that, Ben Zema answered that there's a difference because and after they all ate, the one will make a bracha for all. Because their mouths are not available. In other words, everyone's busy eating. You can't, as Rashi says, no one's listening to the guy making the bracha. They're just focusing on their eating. So since they're all focused on their eating, there's no ability or no time to be having kavana, and so the person going to make a bracha is not going to work. Everybody has to make their own bracha. Says Taisus, Hoyel ve'en beis habli apanoi. Says Taisus, Yesh mefarshim yishomer savri moiri or savri maranim v'rabaise. That if somebody would say savri, v'heim manichem le'achol kedei l'shmei bracha, and they would stop. Somebody says savri, and everybody's like, oh, l'chaim. So everybody now stops and is waiting, and then they stopped eating. So then, kedei l'shmei bracha v'lanes amish yipaturim. So then maybe it would work that one person will be able to might see everybody on the wine. In other words, not like the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says is only in a situation because no one's they're not focused. But if you say Savri and everybody stops, then it will be okay. This is one approach of Tait. That if the Rishal makes a difference between the Orchim who are making a bracha on wine, one person cannot be mevarach for everybody, versus the Baal Bayis. So the Baal Bayis is doing the bracha, then everybody's going to be listening. Especially imagine the situation that Rashi says that we're talking about a situation of a rich Baal Bayis with a bunch of poor Orchim. The Baal Boss is going to say, oh, he's going to Savri. Everybody's listening to him. He's the Baal Boss. They're all here at his table. So then, it sounds like in that situation, one person could make a bracha for everybody. So Taisa continues, and Taisa says, Rabbeinu Elchanan disagrees. He says, once the Chacham already made a decree in the Mishnah that said one person makes a bracha for everybody, then don't start giving me your details and saying, oh, but the Baal Bayis is different, or when he says Savri Maranan, everybody's going to listen. No. Chazal made a takana in the Mishnah, one person makes a bracha for each person has to make their own bracha. That's it. Yayin b'soich hamazon, but there wasn't yayin beforehand, and you have to make a bracha. Each person makes their own bracha. Why? Because of the fact that they're ain beis habli aponoi. That Rebbe Chanan is not happy with the beginning part of Taisvis. It's going to be mistakes. People who are going to be focused, people who are not going to be focused. No, each person should make their own bracha. Then Taisus continues. What about the bracha about Taiva Meitiv? We have discussed that on wine, if you already had wine, the bracha that you make when wine comes then is only on Taiva Meitiv. What about that bracha? Can you make one person have Taiva Meitiv for everybody at the table? Maybe that one should be able to work for other people. Why the kuli am the haki mashma Taiva Atzmi Meitiv Lachrini? What is the Taiva Meitiv? You make a bracha Taiva for yourself and I Meitiv for others. Shame says me menu. Rabbeinu Yechiel of Paris, he disagreed. And he said, no, you shouldn't have a bracha of Ateva Meitiv that one person is making for everybody. The Shachnami ain't basically upon because it could be that not everybody's going to have Kavanah of Ateva Meitiv because their throats are still busy. They're still chewing. They're still eating. It shouldn't make a difference between Ateva Meitiv and the bracha that we would make on one. Since we said that bracha on one, each person is making one bracha for himself, so the bracha of Ateva Meitiv, each person has to make the bracha for themselves. Continues, says, I'm skipping a few lines. Then continues and says, by the bracha of Hatayva Meitav that one makes when one hears about the fact that they had a child, you can make Hatayva Meitav even if your wife is not there. He says you can make a bracha Hatayva Meitav even if your wife's not there because Meitav Lachrin even if the person's not there. And now Taisus continues in the last part of Taisus, which connects back to our Taisus that we had earlier today about Havdalah, is the following. Taisus Avotach Ian Ktatz Me Havdalah. We have a bit of an issue when it comes to Havdalah. Sh'anu Mavdilim Va'imdim. We make Havdalah when we stand. How are we pattering each other on the bracha of Yayin and on the bracha of Havdalah? If we're standing, then what are we not doing? We're not being Kaveh Suda. We're standing. So how are you able to be Moitzi Achrini if you don't have a Kviyas? What do we say? We said in the Mishnah that told us that if people are Yeshiv, everyone has to make their own bracha. It's only if they're Mesiv that you can have one person be Mevarach for everybody. And here, we say that Bisman Hazeh, in the modern era, we don't have to have a sable. We just have to sit at a table. And sitting at a table is enough to be considered Kaveh Suda, that you would be able to have one person make a bracha for everybody. But in this situation now, what? By Havdalah, you're not even sitting at the table. You're standing. So you don't have the Haseva, and you don't have the Kaveh Suda of sitting at the table. You're just standing. So in which case, how are you able to see everybody? This Taisus question. So Taisus says, Taisus suggests maybe since everybody's there to do Havdalah, that's considered a kviyas in itself. Concludes Taisus, it's a nice thing, it's a good thing that everybody who's by Havdalah, both the person making Havdalah and all the people listening to Havdalah, they should all sit b'shas Havdalah, because then you're going to be considered a kviyus, and then you'll be able to be yaitzi for everybody on the ayin on the Havdalah.